You are listening to In the Past Lane, the podcast about history and why it matters.
We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more
to huddled masses yearning to breathe free.
Consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill.
That all men and women are created equal.
Give me liberty or give me death.
Nobody's free until everybody's free.
The government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
History matters because it's not just about the past. History's about us, here and now. It explains the world we live in and why things are the way they are. And history gives us insights into how to achieve a more just, peaceful, and prosperous future. So people, let's do this. Hi there, everyone. Welcome to In the Past Lane, the podcast about American history and why it matters. I'm host Edward T. O'Donnell, your historian at large, and this is In the Past Lane, episode 152, in which I speak with historian Jill Lepore about her best-selling one-volume history of the United States, titled These Truths, A History of the United States. We are brought to you by SBI, Snoring Beagle International, and come to you this week from the George Bancroft Studios, located in central Massachusetts. You can learn more about me, this podcast, and our guests at our website, inthepastlane.com. And on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and our YouTube channel. Guiding us along, as always, is our executive producer, Lulu Spencer, whose life story couldn't possibly be told in a single volume. How's it going in the booth, Lulu?
In podcasting adjusted terms, just dandy.
All right, I'll take it. So, what's happening at In the Past Lane this week? Well, I just got back from a phenomenal family hiking trip in the Rocky Mountains. Longtime listeners to this podcast know that every year or so I head off on a big hiking trip with my daughters, now who are all in their 20s, along with brothers, brothers-in-law, and several of their children, a.k.a. my nieces and nephews, who are also in their 20s. This year we were a group of 11, and we spent 3 days and 2 nights in the Rocky Mountain National Park. We had every form of weather you can imagine: fog, rain, thunder and lightning, hail, brilliant sunshine, and on the last night, 3 inches of snow. Pretty amazing. But no complaints. It was an awesome trip, and we all had a blast enjoying each other's company, sipping fine bourbon around the campfire, and experiencing the incredible natural beauty of the Rockies, which included both gorgeous landscapes and wild animals like elk and moose. And thankfully, no bears. But now I'm back, working on summer projects before heading off on summer trip number 2, the annual family trip to San Antonio to see my wife's family. We'll be there for the 4th of July, so that should be a lot of fun. We'll start the day with a 7 a.m. 5K road race. 7 a.m. because it'll be about 100 degrees by noon. And then we'll finish the day probably with some fireworks. Speaking of July 4th, I'm planning on releasing a bonus episode next week, a reprise of an early In the Past Lane episode on the history of the Declaration of Independence. Even if you've heard it before, you'll likely enjoy it again in the context of Independence Day. At least I hope so. All right, all that's left for me to say is, please consider supporting the podcast for as little as $1 a month. This support helps us pay for some of the expenses associated with producing this podcast. And a special shout out to Harold K. for becoming a $1 a month patron, and Harriet for becoming a $5 a month supporter. Thank you so much. Your support really keeps me going. Okay, people, better pack your toothbrush, because we're about to dive into 400 years of American history. Your journey in the Past Lane begins now. Jill Lepore is professor of history at Harvard University, and she's one of the nation's most prolific and widely read historians. She combines a brilliant and engaging writing style with extraordinary reading, research, and analysis. Over the past 20 years, she's written books on everything from King Philip's War that tore apart New England in the 1670s to the history of Wonder Woman. She also writes insightful essays on history for The New Yorker. Most of us fellow historians marvel at her range of interests and her publishing output. In fact, one of my colleagues is fond of saying, "When I grow up, I want to be Jill Lepore." Well, now she's upped the ante considerably by publishing a sweeping 900-page, one-volume history of the United States. It's a work that's garnered widespread praise and a spot on the New York Times bestseller list. In the course of our discussion, Jill Lepore explains why she chose the phrase, "These Truths," from the Declaration of Independence as the book's title, what the 3 key truths are: political equality, natural rights, and consent of the governed, how concepts of rights like liberty and equality develop over time, how these key American ideals were defined and codified to guarantee them to some Americans while at the same time denying them to others, why she chose to emphasize and weave together both political history and social history, rather than treating them separately, how U.S. history has been shaped by famous people like Thomas Jefferson, as well as lesser-known people who lacked formal political rights, like Maria Stuart, how developments in technology have played a key, often underappreciated role in U.S. history, and how social media and the 24/7 news cycle in contemporary society has diminished Americans' sense of the past. Jill Lepore, welcome to In the Past Lane.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Your book is a big volume, 900 pages or so. So I want to start with the book itself, and I guess the best place to start is with the title of the book, These Truths, which, the phrase comes from one of the most memorable lines in the most famous document in the American canon, the Declaration of Independence. And, I think everybody's pretty familiar with those lines. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And as you note, these are stirring, inspirational words, but also, if one takes an honest look at U.S. history, they can be unnerving and troubling words too, because they basically set an incredibly high standard that we, over time, have often failed to meet. And it occurred to me while reading your book that you could have titled it Hard Truths as opposed to These Truths, because a lot of it has to do with some of those hard truths of American history. So maybe you could tell us how you've made sense of these truths, both the dual aspect of it, the inspirational and the troubling.
Well, I gave the book that title because I wanted to call our attention to the foundational ideas on which the American experiment rests, and also to call our attention to the experimental nature of the nation itself. So the three truths that Jefferson's referring to in the Declaration of Independence are the political equality of all people, natural rights, and the consent of the governed. And we hold those truths to be self-evident? Yes and no, because I think people don't know quite what those three ideas mean, or maybe we think we do, but it certainly bears further inquiry. So I structure the book around, in some ways, the first quarter of the book is trying to explain where those ideas came from. They have histories, they have a past, they had a beginning, and how they came to be so central to the founding of the United States with the Declaration of Independence. And then the rest of the book tries to answer the empirical question Alexander Hamilton asks in the first Federalist paper, which is if it falls to the people of the United States to figure out whether it's possible for people to live up to those ideas, or sort of prove the truth of those ideas, have we proven it or not? And so for me, the title is the book's argument, which is to say the history is an inquiry, and that in a republic, it's the obligation of all citizens to participate in that inquiry.
And I think you noted at a couple of points the idea of this phrase, Republican experiment, or sometimes it's American experiment. And that seems to be a very prominent idea, both historically, but also in the way that you examine the history of the United States. We hear this phrase over and over again in the founding period and well through, pretty much through the 19th century. It's a phrase that politicians and civic leaders go to describe the country. But we know that lots of people in contemporary America like to have a sort of a comforting vision of American history as the founders created wrote an amazing document and then created an amazing system and just wound it up and let it go. And it's pretty clear that in the course of looking at American history that that's not how it works, that these might be self-evident truths, but they're not, self-sustaining. And these truths change over time as different people have stepped forward. So if you could talk a little bit more about this idea of an unfolding Republican experiment and what that has meant over time.
Yeah, I guess it's important to point out the two different ideological extremes that rewrite and reimagine that founding moment. The one, as you say, invokes the founding as sacred and divinely inspired and immutable, and we would associate that today with a conservative political position. And the other damns the founding as a kind of original sin, as the inauguration of centuries of racial oppression and other forms of inequality and hypocrisy. And that would be sort of the hard left ideological interpretation of the founding. And those two ways of thinking about the founding are actually in contest with one another throughout American history after 1776. And it's important to think about their legacies and where those struggles come from. But neither of those positions makes any sense historically. As a matter of historical investigation and historical inquiry, it just, as you say, the way the framers of the Constitution wrote about what they were doing was as an experiment. They were Enlightenment empiricists. They thought they were engaging in an experiment. They wrote about the historical record as a set of experiments from the past that they studied that helped them shape their own experiment. They had a sense of the fragility and tenuous nature of what they were attempting. And that's the spirit in which I write about the whole sweep of American history, which is acknowledging a sense of contingency, paying attention to what evidence tells us and what evidence doesn't tell us, and then being mindful of the ways just different interpretations of the founding are used ideologically in a kind of partisan way, but not falling prey to that myself. That's the work that I try to do in the writing of the story.
Right. And one of the ways in which what you just were talking about sort of comes to the fore is one of the earliest stories that you tell early on in the book comes from 1641, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and the government there trying to lay out some of its ideals, and it creates this document called the Body of Liberties, and it lays out 100 or so rights. So in one level, it's this codification of rights, many of which will end up in the Bill of Rights, some of the most foundational ones. But in the same document, it says, "There shall be no bond slavery, villanage, or captivity among us, unless it be lawful captives taken in just wars, and such strangers as willingly sell themselves or are sold to us." So they're basically saying this is going to be a colony of liberty and liberties, but at the same time saying that there's room for slavery under certain circumstances. Is that a tension that we see throughout the course of American history, where liberty and slavery?
Yeah, that is one of the instances of the use of the word unless that does more work than just about any other instance you could think of the word unless. People are free unless they're not.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I say specifically I intend the book as a kind of old-fashioned civics book. So I spent a lot of time trying to explain what rights are and why people thought it was a good idea to write down these lists of rights, which becomes, in the United States, the Bill of Rights. But the Body of Liberties from 1641 in the colony of Massachusetts is an important predecessor to the Bill of Rights. Of course, the Magna Carta from 1215 is an ancient antecedent to it. There's a lot to think about with regard to just this question, like, why write that down? If these are natural rights, what does the writing them down mean? Do we not agree that they exist, say, separate from being written down? What is the authority that grants to some people the ability to write them down and presumably to grant them to others? So there's a lot to untangle there with regard to the Body of Liberties from Massachusetts in 1641. But it is, as you say, it's a really signal document, but it's a good illustration of the need to kind of put pressure on our interpretation of these things, that it makes no sense to just include the Body of Liberties as another stepping stone in some march toward freedom and equality and not pay attention to the ways in which these notable exceptions are made. And in particular, to not pay attention to the ways in which the actual drafting of the document in the first place was a kind of after-the-fact attempt to justify the enslavement of and the selling off of chiefly Pequot Indians in Connecticut who had been taken captive during the 1637 Pequot War. And the colonists didn't know what to do with these kind of prisoners of war because they would just escape and they would wage war against the English again because the Pequots didn't want the English in Connecticut, and nor did the Algonquins and the Narragansetts. And there was all kinds of real sense on the part of the English colonists that they didn't really have a lawful claim to the land. And what are they going to do when Native peoples wage war against them to oust them from what is their own lands? Well, they come up with this idea that they could sell them to the Caribbean.
Right.
And swap them for African slaves who have been kidnapped from Africa and brought to the Caribbean as enslaved people. There aren't a lot of Africans living in slavery in New England at the time, but the New Englanders are like, well, we can't actually keep our prisoners, our Indian prisoners of war here in New England because that's unsafe. So they ship them to the Caribbean and swap them for slaves. So now they have to justify two different things, right? Taking people as captives in a war. So one of the clauses, unless they be captives taken in just war. So long as they can prove to their satisfaction that the war was just, then they can take whoever they want captive, and or if they be strangers who have, who've been sold to us, which is in the case of going to the Caribbean and doing this trading. So the whole purpose for writing the Body of Liberties in the first place is to justify these actions that are atrocities, even by the standards of 17th century English people. They have to devise a legal apparatus to make it legal that they've just done this thing that is essentially unlawful. And in the context of doing that, they articulate and then codify their own rights and liberties. And that is kind of the signature move, like what's so fascinating about this incredibly enthralling, thrilling actual expansion of ideas of rights and of liberties for the English. It is really thrilling to watch. People begin to kind of claim, rights to freedom of expression and such, but they come always in this much bigger package of a need to talk about who doesn't get those rights.
Right. Edmund Morgan and many other historians have pointed out that tension, that ideas of American liberty are inherently tied to ideas of American slavery. And in fact, the existence of slavery and various forms of unfreedom, it's sort of the other side of liberty, so that as one thinks about why liberty is so important and why liberty is endangered and what could happen if you lose your liberty, you'd become a slave. And that seems to be something that's on the minds of colonists in the 1640s. And it's also very much over 100 years later in the founding period when drafting the Declaration of Independence and then later the Constitution. In some ways, people have looked at that moment of the founding, whether it was a compromise, whether it was a missed opportunity, or how do you see this question of slavery that looms over the founding period and make sense of how the founders, including those who were adamantly opposed to slavery, how they struck that compromise and what they were thinking?
What I argue in the book, and as you say, a large body of scholarship that looks at liberty and slavery in the 18th century, that the New England colonies and the middle colonies were very swiftly moving towards emancipation and abolition in the early 1770s, as was England. And of course, then England does abolish slavery in the 1770s. And what halts that movement in New England and the middle colonies is forging a union with the southern colonies. There's no success in forging a union with the planter colonies in the islands, in the Caribbean, Barbados and Jamaica, which don't join the American Revolution because they cannot make common cause with people that don't have that same economic system. And the most island-like colonies, South Carolina and Georgia, whose economies are completely dependent on chattel slavery or have been designed to be so. In other words, it's really difficult to hold them in the Union. And they're balky about independence. They're balky about the war. They're balky about the Constitution. They threatened to walk out of the Constitutional Convention on several different occasions. And the New England and the Middle States continue to make compromises with them for the sake of the Union. So there is a tremendous tragedy about that political moment, of course, as well as the other piece of it, which is the founding of this government with the consent of the people in the particular way in which the people are defined at the time.
It's a compromise that's aimed at preserving or creating a union, and it's ultimately that compromise with slavery that decades later leads to the near total collapse of the Union during the American Civil War. So some of these questions just keep coming back. What are some of the other tensions that you sort of overarching tensions that you see in the course of, hundreds of years of American history? I mean, when one looks at American history, there are, particularly in our political ideology, there's liberty and slavery, but then there's also one of the tensions that I, in my work, often come to is looking at this tension between the common good versus the individual or individual rights versus rights of the community. There's also tensions between, whiteness and what we'd call white nationalism now and pluralism. Later, isolationism and imperialism. There seems to be a lot of dualities and tensions throughout the course of American history. What ones, stand out for you? What ones do you think are some of the more important ones that you came across and that you developed in the course of your book?
Yeah, well, all of the ones that you list are, of course, developments and changes that I spend a lot of time paying attention to and attempting to help the reader to see with a very kind of long view perspective. There are some commitments of the book that maybe didn't make it onto your list that I would add to it in terms of areas of focus for me. One is that one thing I'm trying to reject is the structuring of historical narratives where we have a political history that is essentially the history of the federal government, especially with an emphasis on presidential administrations. And then we have this social history column or like a little sidebar in the textbook that is what's going on with women and
what everybody else is up to.
Yeah. Social movements and people of color and the working class. And I just personally, I find that nutty. Like it just makes no sense as a historian to me to not look at those two things always together or understand it's more than two things. And when I try to explain this to people, I say, like, if you can imagine someone in the future writing a book about the last few years and it's Donald Trump's first term, someone wrote a book that was really just solely about Trump's presidency and the Trump White House and Trump's relationship with Congress, say, we say, well, what about, the Me Too movement and Black Lives Matter? And those social movements had a huge influence on the context of his presidency and really shaped, in many ways, the course of his administration. Similarly, if someone tried to write a history of these years and just was looking purely at the Me Too movement or at Black Lives Matter, but paid no attention to the election and then the administration of Donald Trump or the Republican-led Congress, you say, well, how could you understand those things, without the context of these, in some ways, these things are kind of proxy wars against Trumpism.
Right.
So I think when we look at the present moment, we can see how nutty it would be to like act as if these things aren't constantly engaged with one another and shaping and defining one another and actually kind of mutually driving each other. So for me, paying attention at the same time to party politics and presidential politics and to social movements and to reform movements, like and understanding them as always being in a conversation with one another is a significant through line of the book. But that also means that for me, even though at times in American history when the people are, say, educated, propertied white men, for me as a historian, the people are everybody. So my political history includes everybody. And a form of political expression is voting and holding an office. But other forms of political expression are fighting for abolition or joining the temperance movement. So that my political history is always attempting to kind of make sure that we see what everybody is doing to shape the direction of the country's politics. So I would say that's a pretty significant, it's not exactly a dualism, but it's a significant intellectual commitment of the book. And the other would be, just because we haven't talked about it yet, is the role of technologies of communication in our political arrangements, which is something that, again, like from our vantage today with Facebook or Twitter, we know actually technologies of communication seem to have an effect on our political arrangements. But that's always been the case, not as dire as it is at this moment. But to provide a backstory for that was one of the objectives of paying attention to the history of technology throughout the whole of the book.
Right. I mean, I think we overuse the word disruption and disruptive technology, but communications technology, or American history and certainly all of history, has been punctuated by these moments of breakthroughs in technology. In 19th century, of course, it's the advent of industrialized printing, but then also the telegraph and also the movement of these things. And so that the nation is suddenly awash in cheap printed matter. And that really has a major impact on everything from religion to the social movements like abolition and temperance, and of course, politics as well. And so we're just living through another, certainly different, but another phase like that. And circling back to what you were saying just prior to that, the idea that, history is all of us. There are some very familiar faces in this book, presidents, inventors, political leaders, and so forth. But there are also people that many Americans have not heard of, people like Maria Stuart, or people they've heard of like Frederick Douglass, but don't know so much about. And, the impact that these people have as they kind of cross the stage, some of them like Frederick Douglass crossing multiple times, really is quite extraordinary. And as you say, maybe they are politically active, but they're also intellectually active, trying to, somebody like Maria Stuart or Frederick Douglass, trying to push Americans to redefine their limited notion of what liberty is, of who a citizen is, and who is entitled to full rights. Maria Stuart's one, but there are lots of others. Who else are these people that we should know about, if there's a couple more?
Yeah, I guess there's a lot of those people. Pauli Murray comes to mind. I spent a lot of time with Phyllis Schlafly. I spent a lot of time on William Jennings Bryan, who I think people don't appreciate. There's also pretty standard intellectuals, Walter Lippmann, people like that. And I guess a point to make is, one, they do expand our notion of what political action means, because Maria Stuart was a black woman, writing in the 1830s. She was not enfranchised, and, arguably black women weren't enfranchised in any full way until 1965, So it's not about the vote. It's about other forms of political leadership and political participation. But also, I wrote this book not for historians. It's for general readers, and there's going to be a textbook version that's for undergraduates. And there's a lot of intellectual history and a lot of political history, and even a lot of history of science and history and religion in this book. And the way that just, as an essayist and as an historian, the way that I notice that readers can take in big ideas is through characters, memorable characters. So Maria Stuart has a lot to say, and she's herself really, really interesting, like completely worthy of biographical attention. But she's also saying stuff that I want the reader to remember and hold on to. When we get to Jim Crow, or when we get to Ida B. Wells, and when we get to Pauli Murray, or when we think about the women's rights movement in the 20th century. So it's not so much like I would like people to know these names, they should be on dollar bills. It's more that I want people to be able to hold on to these ideas and wrestle with these ideas. And, this is the same for me. I will hold on to an idea and, be able to kind of feel it and reckon with it and take the full measure of it if it's introduced to me through a person who's really kind of compelling and memorable.
I completely agree. And certainly as a teacher, that's a key insight, to be able to sort of peg these ideas to people and to their own personal stories. I mean, Frederick Douglass, you could read his speeches and really derive a lot from them. Same with Maria Stuart. But to know their life story as well is essential to really getting the full meaning of what they're talking about and their reference points.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if, in the course of doing such a large book on such a large period of time, would you say that there are moments, sort of key pivotal moments in American history? I don't know, we might call them turning points, or points where the country really went in a different direction. on some of these big questions that have long been with us and are still with us today?
Yeah, I suppose so. I mean, I had to think about how to organize the book. It's organized into 4 parts. I think the beginning and end dates of the 4 parts I selected because they seem to me to be beginnings and endings.
Mm-hmm.
The same is true for each chapter. You know, when you're writing a book like this, you have to make a lot of careful choices, and things like the end date of the chapter. It's really important because you're trying to choose a dramatic moment that embodies the nature of the change, you know. So like the last section of the book, just we've been talking a lot about the 19th century, or 18th and 17th, but the last section of the book, for instance, begins in 1946 and goes to 2016, and it's called The Machine. And I open with the sort of American consciousness of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but the chapter is really largely about the influence of computers on our political arrangements. The first commercial computers are being developed in the late 1940s that come out of the urgent and fervent military innovation during the Second World War. And I hold on to that. I spent a lot of time thinking about the mainframes to the personal computer, to the internet, to social media in that last part of the book to help us make sense of the world that we live in today. You know, of course, you're going to start the last section of a book that goes to the present right after the Second World War. It's a signal turning point, but also kind of then the question is, what's significant about that moment? And what I'm trying to do also is to offer a kind of fresh reading and a slightly different interpretation, and that will, you know, ask people who took their U.S. history class in high school and kind of have a vague memory of, well, there was Jacksonian democracy, you know, then there was the Gilded Age, and then there was the New Deal. Oh, and then I think there was a Great Society. You know,
right.
like, well, actually, maybe it would be interesting to you to revisit that era, thinking about the role of the computer. That happens to be something that, because there's not been a really great penetration of history of science stuff with political history, I don't think I've thought about fully enough. That was actually a really, really fun element to think about.
Especially when you say it seems like such familiar territory and organized in a familiar way through textbooks and through documentaries and also just public consciousness. Well, by way of bringing to conclusion this really fascinating discussion, I'm wondering if the obvious question about history is, should it just be for history's sake, or should it have some relevance for now? And I think your book makes it very clear that history is incredibly relevant. And one thing that seems to be, I guess, one way to look at it is that a deep engagement, a real serious engagement with history does many things for us. And one of the things is it sort of challenges our myths, our oversimplifications. And you point out that this is can be kind of fraught work. You say, to study the past is to unlock the prison of the present. The past is an inheritance, a gift and a burden. It can't be shirked. You carry it everywhere. And you start your book with a very apt quote by Abraham Lincoln, where he says we must disenthrall ourselves because we're sort of, we allow our myths to sort of guide us. And if we disenthrall ourselves, we might be able to save ourselves. So what's a broad takeaway for the importance of a book like this now?
I do think that our sense of the past is fast diminishing, just simply because of the speed with which we receive news and the onslaught of moment-by-moment information about the contemporary. Things that happened quite recently. I mean, you and I are speaking just a few weeks after the confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh to the U.S. Supreme Court. That seems months and months ago to me, even though, it just really is a matter of days. So it can be then very hard to think historically about the Supreme Court. And I think most Americans have a very hard time doing that. And newspaper coverage and magazine coverage has a hard time doing that because people are chasing the sort of viral topical news story that doesn't actually provide any real historical context or ask or demand of people to think about a question historically. You started out by saying that it's a very long book, and it didn't need to be shorter. This is a moment where it's a very compressed account of American history. But the reason that it is the length that it is that I do think it's important to take something on at length once in a while and really try to get to the bottom of something.
Right. You could write we've seen them. I remember looking at George Bancroft's History of the United States, and it's something like, 12 volumes, and I think it only goes up to 1850. So there are examples of people trying to get their arms around American history, and a book like this really has a lot to say in those 800, 900 pages. And in many ways, you can't comprehensively tell the story, but it can expose what are some of the key ideas and some of the key conundrums and challenges that the Americans have faced, and in some ways solved and in some ways not solved, leaving the task still at hand. So, Jill Lepore, this has been a very interesting and fascinating conversation. Your book is outstanding, and I recommend it to everyone. And I want to thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us at In the Past Lane.
Thanks a lot.
Jill Lepore is the author of These Truths, A History of the United States, published by W.W. Norton and available wherever books are sold. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you want to show your love for the podcast, you can buy some of our merchandise. Just go to inthepastlane.com and click on Merchandise. There you'll see more than 50 t-shirts with In the Past Lane logos, not to mention a whole line of shirts with history quotes from notable people like Abraham Lincoln, who once said, "Fellow citizens, we cannot escape history." And Mark Twain, who said, "History does not repeat itself, but it does rhyme." And remember, everything you see at our merchandise page comes as a hoodie, water bottle, coffee mug, stickers, you name it. So check it all out at inthepastlane.com. Thanks. Okay, people, that's all for this episode of In the Past Lane. Thank you so much for tuning in. For more information about the many things we talked about today, head over to our show page for this episode at inthepastlane.com. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe to this podcast at Apple Podcast, Stitcher, Overcast, Spotify, or wherever you access your podcasts. I'm In the Past Lane's host, Edward T. O'Donnell, your historian at large, reminding you that history explains our world. So let's pay attention to it. Thanks for listening. We hope you'll join us next time for another journey in the Past Lane. Hey, Lulu, got any big plans for summer?
You mean other than going to other people's damn weddings?
SBI, Snoring Beagle International.